Right. Okay. So to push it on. No, forward. Okay. All right. Well, it's good to be here. We at Race Relations have a long-standing cordial relationship with the Free Market Foundation. I think on this issue there is a very definite meeting of minds. And what I'm going to talk about is the land reform issue. I think words do mean something, and what I've noticed over the past 3 months is that government spokespeople are no longer using the phrase expropriation without compensation like they used to. They're talking about land reform. It's kind of that's very seductive. No one's against land reform. It's the mechanism that you've chosen to drive it forward that is the problem. And what I'm going to be talking about here is what's wrong with land reform, or what's been shown to be wrong with the land reform program that South Africa has been pushing since the 90s, and how we can get it on track. There's three parts to my talk. It's not as long as it might look at first blush. First of all, I'm going to just set out a few points about land reform in South Africa. What do we mean by land reform? Now, I gave this some thought, and I said, okay, you're talking about altering the manner and distribution of land ownership. And now that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. There was land reform under Mao in China, or under Lenin and Stalin in the Soviet Union, killed a few million people. There was land reform in South Korea and Taiwan, and that laid the basis for first world democracies. I think that the three things that we need to bear in mind: the standard of living, this is on a household level predominantly; future prospects. In South Korea, for instance, one thing that the land reform in the 40s and 50s did was it provided households with the ability to educate their children. And this was a particularly important thing because in Korean culture, education had a status that went beyond human capital. The idea that you were a small farmer, but your child might rise to be a respected person working in an office. Dignity and citizenship. I think this is very important, and this was mentioned yesterday. In South Africa, there's a symbolic politics around this. I, for my sins, collect movies. And anyone who's seen that Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman movie, Home and Away, man without land. Now, that may not actually mean much in a modern economy, but it tickles something inside our psyche. And then economic growth, investment, exports, and food security. This is the countries like Taiwan and South Korea embarked on land reform in order to use the very scanty resources they had, exporting foodstuffs so that they could start to create light industries, and that was the first blush of their economic success. Now, the key question here is the distribution of benefits, or rather their capture. If you read a lot of the academic stuff about land reform, they use this word a lot, the capture of benefits. And I think it's a very meaningful term, because there are various nefarious people who hang around in the back of these policy debates. And I think I just have to mention the word Estina as a wonderful example of that. And this isn't a problem in South Africa. I once spoke to a lady who had written a book on the experience of land reform schemes. It's ridiculous. It was like over the past 2,000 years, she had looked at almost every case. And she said actually there are very, very few where land reform has done what it was intended to do, if you assume it's about providing assets and prospects to poor people. Now, last year there was an academic paper produced by Professor Ruth Hall of the University of the Western Cape and Timbele Kepe, I think, from a university in Canada. Professor Hall is well known. She is associated with the PLAS group at UWC. Therefore, there are certain differences of opinion I would have with her. But this was actually quite a gem to read. And they made a comment: without redistribution of power and wealth to those who are the ostensible beneficiaries, is it even land? And I'll get onto that in more detail in a minute. What is the current policy trajectory? Now, historically, apartheid, the segregation came before it, the colonial, that wasn't just about keeping the black population, or specifically the African population, in a subordinate position. It was essentially saying it was a separate society and, was never going to be on the same level. You needed these distinct African institutions, which, wouldn't you know it, just don't give you the same opportunities. So an African land and property holding was tended to be indirect. You might have access to assets, but they would be held by a traditional. Your agricultural land was held by your traditional leader, essentially in trust, and it was more in trust for the state than for the users. Urban housing, you had you leased from a municipality. In the 1980s, we can remember the 99-year leases. I mean, it was incredibly patronizing. Yes, you can sort of have this for as long as you're going to live, but you're not really going to own it. You're not quite in the club yet. And those who, that's why things like places like the Edendale Valley and Alexandra, became such political hotspots, because it was in those very few places where Africans could actually own things freehold. Now, going back to the high-level panel, the Motlanthe Commission, made some beautiful points. Apartheid denied black people rights in land, not only via dispossession, but also imposing a discriminatory tenure system created via a second-class set of rights. And when I last spoke on a free market foundation, Mr. Lowe made a comment that South Africans, like people all over the world, get expropriated. However, if you happen to be black, coloured, and Indian, odds are you have a title deed and they'll pay you for it. If you happen to be African, well, you may not, and you get shunted out the way, and this is 25 years into democracy. Now today, much of this survived post-94. In the homelands, there's been very little appetite to challenge the vesting of land in traditional authorities, and essentially that's a tenancy system. For those who invoke South Korea as an example, the situation that most closely represents reflects South Korean landholding before they embarked on their landholding was not commercial farms, but it was the homelands, where you had small tenant farmers who were paying over 50-60% of their produce in rent. It's not transparent. No one really knows what who cuts deals or how they cut, and there's variable security for inhabitants. If you happen to have a caring trustee, that's great. If you don't, you're out of luck. And there are regular reports of deals between investors and traditional authorities with implications for ordinary people, but without involvement and consent. And I think this is an issue that, when it comes to mining, it's a difficult one and not always a happy picture. And even without cities, what we've seen is housing being provided without title. So you get shelter, but you don't get property. You don't get something that you can that is really yours. This is essentially the 99-year leasehold without a 99-year leasehold. But the mentality is very much the same. Although I will say that there has been at least some rhetoric around changing this. Now, since the 1990s, what our land reform has been based on is the idea of collective or communal ownership. This is understandable, I think, because particularly in rural communities, because the dispossession that had happened in the past tended to be done on a communal basis. So the idea is that a group of families were shifted out and a group can come back. And also, I think, because there's the desire to benefit large numbers of people. We don't just want, one or two people to benefit. We want to see hundreds and hundreds. Unfortunately, this has been coupled with a very heavily statist view of land reform, and particularly over the past decade. 2010, for instance, options to buy started to be removed. And in 2013, the state land lease and disposal policy, which essentially bars the very idea of ownership, except for those who can farm on a substantial commercial scale, and then after 50 years of farming to the satisfaction of an official who has probably never farmed himself. So you get it when you're 20, keep yourself healthy, because on your 70th birthday you can hobble in on your walker and make your offer. Now, so what does this mean? Well, troubling failure and underperformance, and one can just quote government's own sort of own numbers back at them. There's actually, you'll find it very hard to find an official in government who says that they've done well. There's been the scale of failure is very troubling, and I understand that one of the blowbacks with this is that because projects are organized on a communal basis, you have multiple signatories to every sort of lease and contract. When a number of these people drift off, it becomes impossible to do anything because you can't find the recognized trustees. Elite capture and corruption. That paper that I mentioned by Hall and Kepe, for instance, notes that in the Eastern Cape, you have redistribution projects where not even a lease has been signed by the nominal beneficiaries. And what's happened is that certain agribusinesses have positioned themselves so as to take advantage of land access funding and whatever, to essentially use the redistribution, the beneficiaries as farm labor, extending no rights and no real future. It's a serious problem, and for those who read the Daily Maverick, I just published an article about this theme today. Extensive administrative failure, lack of skills to oversee projects. Sorry, I misspelled oversee there. Indifference towards projects and their beneficiaries. The scale of administrative turmoil in the bureaucracy that oversees land reform is such that one of the previous ministers addressed a group of farmers and saying she wants to discuss what they are doing for land reform, and she is not even willing to discuss the mess in her department because she knows all about it. That came from a minister. And then the triumph of ideology. Instead of recognizing the multifaceted difficulties besetting agriculture, it's chasing a chimera of EWC. Interestingly, not even the government's own research says compensation has been an issue. And if you grabbed every square inch of land tomorrow, you would still be stuck with every problem that you have today. Now, better way forward, and I'm coming to the end. Existing thinking, and it is of great concern to the panel that recent policy shifts appear to default to some of the key repertoires that we used to justify apartheid and colonial rule, that black people can't be trusted with land. Well, there we are, and I think the big question is, do we move away from it? So, new thinking. Do we empower owners or the state? And also to realize that the state is an agent for change and transformation in South Africa. Whatever it may say, however it may conceive itself, it's deeply compromised. We don't have a Singaporean or a South Korean state to oversee this. One can say we don't have the kind of state they have in Botswana. Denying ownership places people at the mercy of this compromised state and vulnerable to depredations by connected interests. And that is why you have a situation in the Eastern Cape where people have been settled on land in which they've essentially become squatters on state land, to the point that there are reports that they have been told that they're not allowed to repair roofs on structures. And it's also, I think, an affront to people's dignity, regarding them as perpetual wards of a supposedly benevolent state. It was said earlier, if people make mistakes, then they should be allowed to make them. And I think that's part of the mindset shift. Certainly, what government has done hasn't been strong evidence of the success of the existing program. And there's also strong evidence that South Africans actually want to own. When I first moved to Johannesburg, one of the first conferences I went to, and I worked at the Institute of Race Relations. There was I spoke to an African gentleman who's probably in his late 60s. Then he worked for the Pretoria municipality, and he said something to me. He says the reason why Africans are not socialists is because we used to own cattle. These were our goods. We did not. We owned them, and this is something very deep, very deep to us. Socialism, I think, just does not work in Africa. Now, secure property rights are recognized as crucial for growth and development. I don't have to expand on that to this audience, and it needs to be built into land reform schemes. Important for business and for also claiming a moral and social stake in the land and in its future. Most important, I think, we have to look at secure ownership for the millions living on communal land. That's something that has basically not been touched since 1994, and it's high time it was. Largest single tract of land owned in South Africa is the Ingonyama Trust. And that's also actually quite good agricultural land if agriculture is your beat. Good soil and good rainfall. Something like 2/3 of the country's rainfalls there. That being said, I do think that the exact process of doing this, of titling, must be carefully considered. Proper ownership, yes. But during that transition process, especially with the kind of state and the institutions we have, needs to be carefully thought out and carefully monitored, because there is a massive potential for abuse. And I would hate to see a well-intentioned plan that could actually produce benefits for millions and millions of ordinary South Africans simply becoming a Gupta fest. And with that, I invite everyone to support our campaign. Thank you.